"Drop that rifle, old man," the voice barked. But Jedediah Boone stood his ground, alone, against a dozen hired guns. His hands trembled, but his voice did not. "This land was bought with blood, and I'll be buried in it before I hand it over." Today, At Kindness Audio brings you the true-hearted story of a weathered cowboy who defied a powerful railroad corporation to protect the soil where his wife was buried. Will one man's love for the land be enough to stop an empire? The wind swept across the prairie like an old tune no one remembered the words to. Jedediah Boone stood on his front porch, leaning against the weathered railing. His eyes sunk deep beneath a wrinkled brow as they traced the outline of his cattle wandering the open field. The old wooden boards creaked beneath his boots, a familiar sound, like a whisper from his past. Behind him, the scent of cornmeal lingered, remnants of the morning's skillet cornbread still warm on the stove. The house, though worn at the edges, stood steady like its owner, stubborn, proud, and quietly aching with memories. A faded photo of Martha on the mantel seemed to catch the morning light just so, as if she were watching too. Beyond the pasture, near the rise where the sun touched the earth, stood the old oak tree, gnarled, steadfast. Martha had planted it their first year here, her laughter ringing through the fields as she patted the soil around its roots. "It'll be taller than you before winter," she'd said. Now it stood guard over her resting place. Jedediah visited it often, but never said much. The tree already knew everything. A distant rumble broke the stillness, heavy wheels against dry dirt. Jedediah straightened as the dust rose in the distance. A sleek black automobile rolled through the gate, flanked by a truck and two suited men with faces that didn't belong to the land. Out stepped Charles Whitmore, shoes too clean, smile too sharp. Jedediah knew the type, city man with soft hands and louder intentions. "Mr. Boone," Whitmore began, removing his hat with a flourish. "A pleasure." Jedediah didn't offer his hand. "What brings you this far from concrete and coffee bars?" Whitmore chuckled politely, handing over a cream-colored envelope. "The Great Northern Rail Company has approved a new line. It will cut through this region, efficient, economic. Your property is, well, it's central to the plan." Jedediah opened the envelope with calloused fingers. Inside was a letter, stamped official, and a check. "This is compensation," Whitmore continued. "Above market rate, you could move to town, find comfort in your later years." Jedediah's eyes didn't flinch. "You think I've been living here waiting to die in comfort?" Whitmore shifted. "We believe in progress, Mr. Boone." Jedediah folded the letter slowly, deliberately, and tucked it into his back pocket. "Progress didn't build this place. Blood did. Sweat did. That oak tree yonder? My wife planted it the day we buried our first calf. This house saw my son's first steps. That barn out back stood through 3 storms and 1 fire. And you want me to trade it for a number on a piece of paper?" Whitmore's smile faltered. "We can't delay the line. With or without your cooperation, it's happening." Jedediah stepped down from the porch. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked past the car, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then you'll be building your tracks over my bones." There was silence. Only the wind carrying dust and tension. Whitmore nodded to his men. They turned, got in the car. The engine started with a hum too smooth for this place. As the vehicles rolled away, their steel wheels cut deep lines into the dry prairie earth. Jedediah stood alone again, his hand resting on the porch post carved with Martha's initials. He looked toward the oak tree, now swaying gently. as if whispering back. He remembered the day she planted it, her hands muddy, her eyes bright, the laughter that followed when he accidentally stepped in the watering bucket. She'd kissed him right there under the early sun and said, "This tree's gonna outlive us both, Jed." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that knew both joy and sorrow. Then slowly he turned and walked back inside, but the sound of the tires still echoed across the land, like a warning not yet spoken aloud. A thin blanket of morning mist lay across the prairie, softening the edges of the world in pale gray light. From the porch of his weathered ranch house, Jedediah Boone could just make out the glint of something unnatural among the grasses, cold and silver, like a dagger stabbed into the earth. As the sun rose slowly behind the hills, the fog began to lift, revealing a line of iron survey stakes recently driven into his land. Each one stood defiant, glinting with fresh hammer marks. They hadn't wasted time. He squinted. Near the far fence, two men in canvas jackets were pacing out steps, holding maps, hammering more stakes into the damp ground. Their breath formed clouds in the morning chill. Jedediah's jaw tightened. The memory of Charles Whitmore's gaze from the day before came rushing back, measured, smug, certain. That man had walked off Jedediah's land as if he already owned it. Not today. Jedediah stepped inside, where the kitchen still smelled faintly of kerosene and old wood. He reached above the mantel and took down his Winchester rifle, wiped the barrel with a faded cloth, and checked the chamber. It wasn't for hunting this time. Outside, his chestnut gelding waited as if it had sensed the tension in the air. Jedediah mounted swiftly, the leather saddle creaking under his weight. As he rode out toward the workers, the prairie wind pressed against him like resistance from the land itself. The cows had scattered, pushed away from their grazing grounds by the strangers. One of the workers, tall, lean, with a thick mustache, raised his hand in greeting. "Morning," he called out. "We're with the rail company. Just marking the line. Won't take but a day or two." Jedediah didn't slow down. When he was 20 feet away, he pulled the reins, bringing the horse to a stop, the hooves thudding hard into the soil. "I didn't give permission," he said flatly. The other man, Earl Jenkins, a younger fellow with sun-reddened skin and a slight limp, stepped forward. "We've got papers, sir. It's all legal, eminent domain and all that." Jedediah raised the Winchester slowly, resting it across the saddle. The metal caught the sunlight. "I said, you're on my land." Earl hesitated. "Sir, we don't want trouble." Jedediah's voice dropped an octave, low and gravelly. "You're driving iron into ground my wife bled into, planting wildflowers. These hills are not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone." He aimed the rifle slightly higher. "Anyone takes one more step," he said clear and loud, "I shoot." The prairie fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The two men glanced at each other. Earl raised both hands slowly. All right. We'll go." They gathered their tools in silence, pulling up the last few stakes with shaking hands. Jedediah watched them the whole time, Winchester unmoved, eyes colder than the morning dew. As the workers retreated down the slope, Jedediah remained still, only lowering his rifle once their truck disappeared into the haze. He turned the horse back toward the homestead, the rifle resting across his legs. That night, he sat alone by the wooden table in the kitchen. The lantern flickered softly, casting long shadows on the wall. His hands, thick and scarred from years of fence work and branding, moved with quiet precision as he cleaned the rifle. The oil-soaked cloth glided over the barrel, slow and steady. Outside, Darkness stretched across the prairie, but just as he reached to blow out the lamp, a sound pierced the silence. Clang, clang, clang. Faint, metallic, rhythmic. From somewhere out past the hills, the unmistakable echo of hammer on steel rang out in the night. They hadn't given up. They'd just waited for him to sleep. Jedediah set the rifle back on the table. The flame from the lantern trembled slightly, casting his silhouette against the log wall behind him. His shoulders didn't shake, but his eyes, those old eyes that had seen love and death and too many battles with the land, narrowed. There was no mistaking the message. They were coming back. A few days later, just after midday, a thick cloud of red dust began to rise along the dirt road cutting through the prairie. The sun, high and hot, cast long wavering shadows across the parched land as the rumble of wagon wheels and hoofbeats reached the ears of Jedediah Boone. He stepped out from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his weathered hand. His eyes squinted into the heat shimmer ahead. The sound was familiar but heavier, more deliberate. Then he saw them. 3 wagons, each loaded with timber, rope, and fencing tools, flanked by men on horseback. There were a dozen of them at least. Most wore matching dusters and wide-brimmed hats, their rifles slung casually across their saddles like they had nothing to prove. But one rode in front, straight-backed, confident, with a silver star pinned to his coat, though Jedediah doubted it came with any real authority. Frank Delaney. Jedediah had heard of him, ex-military turned rail enforcer, a man who got paid not just to move fences but to make folks disappear when they stood in the way of progress. As the group stopped near the disputed field, Delaney dismounted and walked forward, kicking up dust with each step. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You had your warning, old man," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Now we build." Jedediah didn't answer. He was already holding the Winchester in both hands, resting it against his chest like a prayer book. The wind rustled the brittle grass at his feet. Without waiting for a reply, Delaney waved his arm. "Put it up." The hired men jumped into motion, dragging heavy wooden posts from the wagons and driving them into the ground with iron mallets. Each metallic clang rang out across the prairie, an echo of the ghostly hammering from nights before. Dust spiraled upward as the fence line extended, inch by inch, across Jedediah's land. Jedediah took one step forward. The sharp crack of his rifle split the air. The post closest to the men exploded into splinters, sending one worker stumbling backward. The cows grazing nearby scattered in alarm, their cries rising above the smoke. The scent of burning grass and cordite mingled, choking the air with something bitter. Delaney didn't flinch. "Return fire!" But before any shot was taken, another bullet rang out. This time it hit a metal stake, snapping it clean in two. The fence crew ducked, one man falling from his horse in a tangle of limbs and shouts. The rest scrambled behind the wagons, clutching their weapons but hesitating to shoot. Jedediah moved slowly now, keeping low as he made his way to a patch of rock near the edge of the field. From there, he had the high ground, but not the strength of youth. His breath was already coming faster, his hands trembling not with fear, but from the weight of history pressing down on him. Delaney shouted again, "He's bluffing!" "Push forward." But no one moved. The prairie had gone still, save for the flicker of dust in the sun and the distant lowing of frightened cattle. Then the wounded man groaned from where he'd fallen. His leg twisted, his pride worse. Jedediah lowered his rifle just a little, then spoke. I planted every inch of this land with Martha. You think I'll let it fall for a company check and a signature?" Delaney didn't answer. He turned back toward the wagon and, after a moment of silence, swung up onto his horse. "Fall back," he muttered. "For now." The hired guns didn't argue. Wheels creaked, hooves churned the dirt. Slowly the caravan turned and rolled away, retreating the same way it had come. But as the last wagon disappeared over the rise, its iron-rimmed wheels carved deep tracks into the dry ground, leaving scars that wouldn't fade with the wind. Jedediah stood frozen for a while, watching the dust settle. Then, with a groan, he slumped beside a boulder at the edge of the pasture. The heat pressed against his skin, the rifle resting across his knees. His hand reached down, almost unconsciously, and brushed the dry soil beside him. "Martha," he whispered, his voice barely a thread. "I did what I had to." Above him, the prairie stretched wide and golden, but inside he felt the weight of coming storms. The news spread faster than prairie fire in dry grass. By the time the sun climbed above the church steeple in town, every table in Clara Mayfield's diner was full. Folks leaned in close, spoons paused midair, coffee half-sipped, mouths hanging open as someone retold the story of Jedediah Boone, standing alone against a dozen hired guns. "They say he fired first," one old-timer whispered. "And made 'em run with their tails tucked," another chimed in. Clara moved between tables with her usual grace, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee and slid plates of hot apple pie across the counter. Her eyes kept drifting toward the front door, waiting. At last, the bell over the entrance jingled. Jedediah stepped inside, dust still clinging to his boots, his hat in hand. The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Then Clara smiled. "Jedediah Boone," she said gently, "you sit yourself down before that coffee gets cold." He gave her a slow nod and took a seat by the window. The smell of roasted beans and cinnamon filled the air. Outside, townsfolk passed by, some glancing in through the window, others tipping their hats in quiet respect. Clara placed a mug before him and sat across with a slice of pie. "On the house," she added, then lowered her voice. "You all right?" "I'm still here," he answered, his voice dry. A chair scraped nearby as Samuel Carter approached. A barrel-chested man with silver at his temples, he pulled up a seat without asking. "You don't have to stand alone, Jed." Jedediah blinked, surprised. Didn't figure anyone else cared much. Samuel leaned in, his hands folded. "We care. We always cared. Just didn't know it would come to rifles and railroad men." Another voice piped in, young and eager. "I want to help." It was Tommy Reed, not more than 16, cheeks flushed and eyes burning with purpose. He stood near the counter, fists balled tight at his sides. Jedediah looked at him. "You got chores, boy. A family." "I got eyes too," Tommy shot back. "I saw what they did." "If they take your land today, it's ours next." Clara spoke then, her voice quieter but no less steady. "My herald worked for the old Pacific Line, promised steady pay, good hours. One morning the brakes failed on a mountain descent. They buried what was left of him in 3 pieces. She placed her hand on Jedediah's. Don't let him tell you it's just business." Silence lingered. Outside, the wind rattled the diner's tin sign. Inside, something shifted, not just in Jedediah, but in the room itself. A shared understanding passed from table to table, like a quiet vow. He swallowed, the lump in his throat thicker than he expected. "I've fought too many fights alone," he said. "Didn't know anyone be willing to stand with me." Samuel reached across the table and placed a firm hand on Jedediah's shoulder. "We ain't letting them take this land, Jed. Not from you, not from anyone." From the doorway, more townsfolk had gathered, some with work-worn faces, others with hands stained by ink and ledgers. But all were looking to Jedediah now, not with pity, but with resolve. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a relic. He felt like a man with a place and people worth standing for. As the sun dipped lower, casting gold across the wooden floorboards, Clara refilled his cup. "They're gonna come back," she warned. Jedediah nodded, then let him. Outside, clouds gathered near the horizon, their bellies dark and heavy. But inside, a different kind of storm was building, a quiet, stubborn kind that starts in the heart and refuses to back down. Samuel's voice was soft but unshakable. "We'll stand together, Jed. All of us." "They got new guns," Samuel muttered, as he pulled an old rifle from its oiled wrapping. "We only got courage." Jedediah nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the flames flickering in the center of the barn. Around them, the Boone cattle shed had been cleared of livestock. Now it served as something else entirely, a makeshift gathering hall, an armory of rusted conviction and rope-bound grit. The fire crackled low in an old metal barrel. Its light danced across weathered faces and nervous hands. Shadows stretched along the hay-scattered floor. Tommy stood near the far wall, a shotgun too long for his shoulders cradled in trembling arms. Outside, the wind howled faintly, rattling the wooden beams. Inside, silence reigned except for the soft click of metal and the occasional creak of a rocking boot heel. Jedediah knelt beside a crate, slowly cleaning the barrel of his Winchester. "These ain't fancy guns," he said, voice thick with smoke and memory, "but they've seen truth." Samuel, seated across, loaded shells into a revolver with surprising steadiness for a man his age. "Truth don't stop bullets, Jed." "No," Jedediah replied, "but it tells you which way to aim." Tommy stepped forward then, uncertain. "Can I try?" he asked, lifting the rifle halfway. The others watched, not mocking, not smiling. Jedediah rose, walked over, and placed a firm but gentle hand over the boy's. "Not like that," he said, adjusting Tommy's stance. "You gotta feel the weight, not fight it." Tommy nodded, lip caught between his teeth. Jedediah reached around and guided the boy's finger to the trigger, then moved his own hand to steady the barrel. "Breathe out," he whispered, "like you're letting go of something heavy." The shot cracked sharp into the night, splintering a fence post 20 yards out. Tommy blinked, half stunned by the kick. I didn't think I could." "You didn't have to think," Jedediah said, patting his shoulder. "You just had to believe your hands could do hard things." In the corner, an old farmer named Ellis began knotting rope into lassos. Another man, Miguel, laid out tin lanterns and flint. Around the fire, a quiet unity hardened. No one said they would win. They only said they would not yield. Jedediah stepped back toward the fire, the weight of years settling in his bones. His eyes, tired but clear, caught the dancing flames, and for a moment they transformed into another fire, many years ago. A boy, perhaps 12, standing barefoot in the dust, awkwardly shouldering a rifle too large for his frame. Jedediah had knelt behind him then, too. "Line it up, son. Don't squeeze the trigger. Press it like you're touching the world, gentle." The shot had missed wide, and they'd both laughed. A laughter he hadn't heard in years. That boy's laughter. That boy, gone before his voice ever deepened. The memory passed like wind through tall grass, soft, sudden, gone. Back in the present, he turned toward the others. "They'll come soon, with iron wheels and iron hearts. But we got more than bullets here. We got land worth keepin'," Samuel added. "We got each other," said Miguel. Tommy stood up straighter. "We got reason." Outside, the night deepened. Coyotes howled faint on the far hills. The fire snapped one last time, casting sparks into the rafters. Then silence. Until the rumble began. Far off but unmistakable, below thunder of engines, wheels grinding against gravel, moving fast. Jedediah walked to the barn door and opened it just a crack. Down the ridge, along the distant ridgeline, a dark smear moved. Headlights flickered, engines growled, and dust billowed upward, veiling the mountains beyond in a choking haze. He didn't speak, just watched, steady as stone. Behind him, the men and boys stood still, waiting. The storm was coming, and this time they wouldn't stand alone. The sound of hooves thundered across the dry earth, shaking loose dust from fence posts and scaring crows into the sky. Jedediah stood on the ridge, rifle in hand, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his weather-worn hat. Behind him, Samuel, Clara, Tommy, and a line of neighbors held their ground, weapons drawn, hearts pounding like war drums. From the southern trail, the convoy came fast. 2 black wagons, each pulled by 4 horses, kicked up clouds of red dust. Behind them, a squad of hired riders galloped in formation, led by Frank Delaney and Charles Whitmore. The devil in a fine gray coat and a smirk like rusted steel. They pulled up near the edge of Boone's property, right where the golden grass gave way to open field. The sun hung high, harsh and unforgiving. Wind blew across the prairie, scattering seed heads and tension in equal measure. Whitmore dismounted with practiced grace and stepped forward, holding a roll of parchment high for all to see. "This," he said loudly, voice clipped and clean, "is a government-sanctioned order. This land is condemned for public development under Federal Expansion Clause 14. You are now trespassing." Jedediah didn't flinch. He walked forward with slow, deliberate steps, until he stood just a dozen paces away. The others held back, weapons at their sides, but ready. "I built this land with my bare hands," Jedediah said, "with Martha. With sweat and years you couldn't buy with all your company's money." Whitmore smiled, unbothered. "The law doesn't care who cried over the dirt, only who signs the deed." Frank Delaney moved beside him, resting his hand on his revolver. "You gonna back down, Boone?" Jedediah raised his rifle, not yet aiming, but steady. "No." Samuel stepped forward, eyes locked on the hired guns. "Neither are we." Clara stood behind them, firm as the chapel pillars, her face pale but unshaken. Tommy, hands trembling, aimed his weapon low, but didn't back away. More townsfolk appeared from the north and west, fathers, sons, and mothers, forming a ragged but unbroken line. Whitmore sighed. "You really think you can win this?" "No," Jedediah replied, "but sometimes standing's more important than winning."
Delaney spat. "Enough of this! Fire!" The first shot cracked from his side, tearing through the air and grazing the wagon wheel behind Clara. She dropped low with a scream. The prairie exploded into chaos. Gunfire roared across the field. Dust leapt skyward as bullets struck ground and wood. Tommy fired blindly, nearly dropping his rifle from the recoil. Samuel ducked behind a fallen fence post, returning fire in steady bursts. Jedediah moved like a man half his age, reloading and firing with a precision carved by decades. Men shouted, horses reared, smoke curled in thick, angry ribbons, painting the field in smudged gray and brown. In the middle of it all, a new sound rose, deep, resonant, cutting through the gunfire. "Stop this!" A single voice. Reverend Paul emerged from the church road, robes fluttering in the wind, a worn Bible held aloft in one hand. His eyes burned, not with fear, but with fury.
"In the name of God Almighty, stop this madness!" Shots slowed, then ceased. For a moment silence fell again, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the soft creak of wagon leather. Frank's hand hovered over his pistol. Whitmore stepped back, unsettled. The Reverend strode into the no-man's land between both sides, the book still raised. "Brothers, this is not a battlefield. This is sacred land, tilled by love, watered by loss." Jedediah lowered his rifle, breathing hard. Samuel followed suit. One by one the townsfolk stepped back, their weapons sagging. But the smoke didn't clear. Behind the lines the wounded cried out, horses whinnied, dust still drifted across the sun-scorched field. And somewhere beyond the chaos, the sound of another engine whispered on the wind. The sun hadn't yet cleared the hills when the ground turned red. Dust hung thick in the morning light, swirling with gun smoke and the copper scent of blood. The prairie, once golden and still, now lay bruised and battered. Hoofprints trampling the wild grass, spent shells glinting like tiny bones in the dirt. Jedediah stood motionless for a moment, heart pounding against his ribs. Around him, the cries of the wounded echoed like wind caught in a bottle. Somewhere to the left, a cow bellowed in confusion, darting across the broken fence line. The herd, frightened by the gunfire, scattered in every direction, their hooves thundering across the plain. And then, "Jed!" Samuel's voice cut through the noise. Jedediah turned and saw him stumbling, clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. "Samuel!" He rushed forward, dropping to his knees as Samuel collapsed behind a mound of dry grass. A shallow groove along his rib cage bled steadily, staining his shirt a deep, angry red. "It's not deep," Samuel muttered, grimacing, "but it burns like hell." Jedediah yanked a rag from his satchel and pressed it to the wound. His hands shook, rough fingers fumbling with the knot. "Hold still, damn it," he said, though his voice betrayed more fear than anger. "Never seen your hands tremble before," Samuel said with a half-smile. Jedediah didn't answer. Behind them a shout rang out, high, panicked. "Tommy!" Jedediah spun to see the boy cornered near a broken wagon axle, his rifle knocked from his grasp. One of the hired guards, a thick-set man with a scar under one eye, raised his weapon, aiming straight for the boy's chest. Jedediah moved without thought. He rose, lifted his Winchester, and fired. The shot rang out like a crack of judgment. The man crumpled to the ground, dust puffing beneath his weight. Tommy scrambled backward, shaking. Jedediah reached him in seconds, pulling the boy behind a wagon wheel and thrusting the rifle back into his hands. "You don't drop this again," he barked. Understand? Tommy nodded, tears streaking his dirt-smeared face. More gunfire echoed across the field, but it was thinning, sporadic, uncoordinated. The townsfolk had taken cover, some tending to the wounded, others holding their line. On the other side, Whitmore's men began pulling back. Jedediah stood tall in the center of the chaos, chest heaving, sweat and dust caking his brow. He raised his voice above the clamor, shouting into the prairie wind. "This land ain't for sale, and it sure as hell ain't for the taking." The words rang out across the field, carried by silence as the shooting ceased. One by one, the guards lowered their weapons, glancing toward Whitmore for direction. Whitmore didn't move at first. He stood beside his wagon, face unreadable, gloves spotless despite the dirt that clung to every other man. His eyes locked with Jedediah's across the trampled earth, not anger, not fear, just a cold, calculating stare. Then, without a word, he climbed into the wagon, gave a sharp nod to Frank Delaney, and turned away. The retreat began, not in haste, but with the unsettling calm of men who planned to return. The iron wheels of the wagon carved deep ruts through the prairie, marking the land like scars. Jedediah lowered his rifle slowly, shoulders sagging with the weight of all he'd carried in those few violent minutes. He turned back toward Samuel, who now lay propped against a rock, face pale but alert. "You'll live," Jedediah said, forcing the words past his tight throat. "Wouldn't want to miss the next fight," Samuel answered. As Jedediah tightened the bandage, his fingers trembled again, just enough to betray the truth. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of losing the people who stood with him. He finished wrapping the wound and sat down beside Samuel, silent. Around them, the wounded were tended to, and the survivors gathered in stunned stillness. In the far distance, the company's wagons disappeared beyond the ridge, the dust behind them slowly settling back to earth. But in Jedediah's chest, nothing had settled. Not yet. It was Sunday morning, and the old wooden chapel stood quiet against the sky, weathered boards creaking softly in the prairie wind. The sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting soft reds and blues onto the wooden pews where every soul in town had gathered. From the front, Reverend Paul's voice rose steady and sure, leading the congregation in a hymn that shook the dust from the rafters. The voices, some strong, some frail, came together like threads in a patchwork quilt, imperfect, but warm and whole. Jedediah sat in the back row, hat in his lap, hands clasped tight. Next to him, Samuel leaned forward with a stiff shoulder still bandaged. Clara Mayfield sat a few rows ahead, her gray bun pinned neat, a fresh pie wrapped in cloth at her side. Tommy, eyes solemn, clutched his Bible as if it might fly from his hands. As the final note faded, Reverend Paul stepped down from the pulpit. He looked out at his flock, faces lined with sun and worry, and spoke without a script. "This land has always tested us," he began, "but it's never broken us. Not by storm, nor drought, nor man with paper and guns." He paused, letting his words settle like silt in a creek bed. "Last week we saw a man fall for defending what's right. And we saw an old cowboy take a bullet out of a boy's path without blinking." All eyes turned to Jedediah. Reverend Paul raised his hand. "I say today we don't just pray, we promise." Murmurs rippled through the chapel. He walked slowly down the center aisle, voice low but clear. "I ask you now, if they come again, if that smoke returns to our skies, will you stand with your neighbor?" One by one, hands rose. Calloused fingers, work-worn palms, wrinkled knuckles, raised not out of anger but resolve. Even young Tommy stood, his jaw clenched, his arm trembling. Samuel gave a grunt and forced his injured shoulder upward. Clara stood last, both hands held high, tears brimming in her eyes. "I've buried a husband because of their rails," she said. "I won't bury another neighbor." Outside, the town spilled from the church like water from a broken barrel. They gathered in the square where the sun beat down on hats and heads alike. Clara passed around bread, smoked jerky, and jars of water drawn fresh that morning. The women filled satchels, the men checked buckles and belts. Tommy helped load crates of canned beans and dried apples onto a wagon. As afternoon crept in, the townsfolk made their way to the edge of Jedediah's land. There, along the rise overlooking the eastern field, they formed a line, dozens long. Old farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, mothers, and sons, each holding something, an old hunting rifle, a rusted saber from a forgotten war, even wooden pitchforks sharpened to points. They weren't soldiers, but they stood like one. At the center, Jedediah stepped forward. He didn't speak. Instead, he turned to the field, the wind tugging gently at the edges of his coat. He pulled from his pocket a small silver locket, rubbed the surface with his thumb, and whispered so low no one could hear, "Martha, looks like I'm going to have to fight again." A hush fell over the prairie. Then, from beyond the hills, a plume of dark smoke rose into the sky, thick and unnatural. The earth trembled faintly beneath their boots. Somewhere in the distance a whistle blew, shrill and cold. The company was coming back, and this time they were bringing more than papers. They were bringing war. The night was still. A thin wind swept through the dry grasslands, whispering through the split-rail fence and around the corners of the Boone house like a ghost too tired to haunt. On the porch, the soft flicker of a kerosene lamp cast a golden halo against the old wood. Jedediah sat in his rocking chair, his boots planted firm, hands folded atop his lap. His shadow stretched long across the floorboards, swaying slightly with the chair's rhythm. From his seat, he could see the outline of the East Ridge, where just that morning, black smoke had curled into the sky like a warning. He could still hear Whitmore's cold voice echoing in his memory, measured, deliberate, like a man too sure of himself. "They'll be back," Jedediah muttered. "Only question is how many." Behind him, the screen door creaked. Tommy stepped out, rubbing his arms against the chill. The boy wore a coat a size too big, cinched at the waist with a piece of old rope. He didn't speak at first, just stood there beside Jedediah, looking out at the prairie wrapped in dusk. "Hard to sleep," Tommy said finally. Jedediah gave a slow nod. "Storm's coming. Hard to sleep through that." Tommy shifted from foot to foot, eyes flicking toward the dark horizon. "Are you scared?" he asked. Jedediah didn't answer right away. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Carefully, he unwrapped it to reveal a faded red kerchief, the edges worn, the stitching frayed but still intact. "Martha made this," he said softly, "back when the winters were rough and the roof leaked like a busted canteen." He held it out to Tommy. The boy blinked. I can't take that." "You will," Jedediah said firmly. "She made it to keep warm, to hold tight when the nights were long. You keep it close, no matter what happens." Tommy took it with both hands, cradling it like it might fall apart at the touch. His voice caught in his throat. "I won't leave you," he whispered. Jedediah turned to him, his eyes darker than the sky. "That's not what I asked." If the fighting gets bad, you run. You find Clara or Reverend Paul. You live, boy. That's how you fight for this place. By livin' to tell its story. I said I won't leave, Tommy repeated, louder this time. Not unless you do. There was silence. Then Jedediah reached out, rested a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, and gave a squeeze. You're stubborn, he said, voice hoarse. You taught me that, Tommy replied, and for a moment neither spoke. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters, tugging at the edges of the roof. Somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied, uneasy. Jedediah stood. I need a moment, he said, alone. Tommy nodded and slipped back inside, leaving the door ajar. Jedediah stepped down from the porch and walked slow, boots crunching against the dry soil. He passed the barn, the chicken coop, the old trough with a crack running through its base, and made his way toward the lone oak tree that stood tall behind the house. It had been Martha's tree. She'd planted it on their first anniversary, saying something about deep roots and strong limbs. For years it gave shade to her garden and caught the swing of their son's rope tire. Now it stood watch over her grave. Jedediah knelt beside the simple stone marker, brushed away a few dead leaves, and placed his palm flat against the earth. I don't know how tomorrow's gonna go, he murmured, but I'll face it, like you would have wanted. He paused, closing his eyes. Boys are with me, even the ones I thought never would be. Towns lit up with fire in their bellies. You'd be proud of them, Martha. You'd be proud of what they're about to do. He lingered there a long while, until the wind cooled and the stars blinked bright above. Then, just as he rose to his feet, a low rumble shivered through the ground. He turned. From beyond the east ridge the sound came again, distant hooves, the groan of wagon wheels, the metallic rattle of gear and iron. The horizon pulsed faintly with movement, a blur of shadows growing nearer. The storm had begun to roll in. Jedediah tightened his coat, one hand resting on the butt of his rifle. Tomorrow, the real fight would come. The dawn came in colorless, like the breath of a tired giant. Gray light spilled across the Boone pasture, stretching over the frost-stiff grass, the split fences, and the hills beyond. Dust curled in thick red clouds near the horizon, blotting out the sun as the sound of wheels and hooves grew heavier, closer. The ground trembled as though the earth itself feared what was coming. Jedediah stood in the field, his boots buried in dew-soaked dirt. Beside him, Samuel clutched an old rifle. Clara's hands were steady, despite the tremble in her breath. Tommy's jaw clenched, eyes locked on the rising dust. Behind them, nearly 40 townsfolk lined the edge of the prairie, shoulder to shoulder, their faces painted with resolve and grit. In the distance, a dark line took form. It wasn't just a few wagons this time. It was a small army. Steel-rimmed wheels groaned under their cargo, crates of tools, supplies, and firearms. Mounted men in black coats rode at the flanks. At the center, atop a high black stallion, sat Charles Whitmore. Beside him, Frank Delaney, grim-faced and locked in silence. The procession rolled to a halt just shy of the fence line. Whitmore's voice rang out, cold and clean across the prairie. "Jedediah Boone," he called. "This has gone far enough. You are standing on government-sanctioned development land. By law, you're trespassing." Jedediah took one slow step forward, the wind tugging at his coat. "This land was bought with sweat and buried with blood," he said. "A piece of paper
Don't erase a lifetime. Frank shifted in his saddle, eyes scanning the townsfolk. You think this ragtag bunch can hold off what's coming? Jedediah's grip on his Winchester tightened. We're not here to hold off, he said. We're here to stand. Behind him, Clara stepped forward. She didn't speak. She only raised a worn, leather-bound Bible and held it tight against her chest. Whitmore's eyes narrowed.
You're risking lives for a sentiment. Better that, Samuel called out, than sell our souls for silver. The two sides stared at one another, a thick silence hanging in the air, until a cow bolted from the nearby herd, spooked by the tension. It ran between the lines, breaking the spell. Whitmore nodded toward Frank. Enough, he muttered. Frank raised his arm. Jedediah barely had time to yell down before the first shots cracked through the dawn. Gunfire erupted like thunder rolling off the hills. Smoke curled from barrels. Sparks flew off rocks and metal. People screamed. The sharp twang of ricochet whistled past ears. Dirt exploded into the air, and cattle scattered in every direction, lowing in terror. Tommy dropped to the ground, crawling for cover behind a wooden trough. Jedediah ducked behind a wagon wheel, returning fire toward the blackcoats advancing. Samuel barked orders to the men flanking the east fence. Clara stayed still in the center, crouched behind an overturned crate, eyes shut tight. The Bible still pressed to her chest. Lord, she whispered, keep us steady. Across the pasture, Frank cursed and waved men forward, but they stumbled in the high grass, disoriented by the smoke and chaos. A bullet shattered a wagon spoke near Whitmore's feet. His stallion reared, nearly throwing him. He snarled and yanked the reins, backing away. Jedediah could hear Tommy shouting for someone, maybe Clara, maybe Samuel. His own ears rang with the sound of gunfire, his shoulder aching from the recoil of the Winchester. He saw men fall. He saw men stand again. He saw hope, not in their weapons, but in how none of them ran. It was a stand, not perfect, not elegant, but real. The wind shifted suddenly, blowing smoke back toward the corporate line. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Men yelled, horses cried out. Even Whitmore had to shield his face. Through the haze, Jedediah could just make out Samuel, blood at his temple, still aiming true. Clara's voice began to rise, not in fear, but in song. A low, wavering hymn that cut through the clamor. Others joined, first one voice, then three, then dozens. The air, thick with smoke and fear, now carried a defiant chorus. Frank raised his rifle again, but paused, unsettled by the sound. Jedediah stepped into the open. His voice rose above the hymn. This land ain't for sale, and it ain't yours to take. Whitmore didn't respond. Instead, he turned his horse and pulled back. The gunfire slowed, replaced by coughing, sobbing, and the rustle of trampled grass. But it wasn't over. The storm had not passed, only shifted. Jedediah scanned the field, eyes burning from smoke, ears ringing, breath heavy. The sky above was pale and empty, but the prairie still roared in his veins. Dust hung heavy in the air, thick and choking, clinging to sweat-soaked skin and seeping into every breath. The acrid stench of spent gunpowder blanketed the prairie like a ghost no wind could chase away. The cries of wounded men mingled with the panicked bellows of scattered cattle, forming a chorus of chaos that gripped the land by the throat. Jedediah stumbled through the haze, boots slipping in churned-up earth. His eyes burned from smoke, and the heat of his Winchester barrel seared his palm as he searched frantically for Samuel. "Samuel!" he shouted, voice raw, desperate. A few yards ahead, slumped near a broken fence post, lay the familiar shape of his oldest friend. Blood had soaked through Samuel's shirt, dark and thick, blooming across his chest like a final, irreversible truth. Jedediah dropped to his knees. No. No, no, no. Samuel blinked slowly, lips parted as though trying to speak. His breaths came in shallow, rasping pulls, each one harder than the last. Jedediah pressed one hand against the wound, as if sheer will might stop the bleeding, while the other gripped his rifle tight. Gunfire still cracked around them, but Jedediah paid it no mind. Tommy's voice cut through the din, high, terrified. "Mr. Boone, behind you." Instinct surged. Jedediah turned, raised his rifle, and fired in a single motion. One of the black-coated attackers collapsed mid-run, his weapon flying from his hands. Smoke curled around the barrel. Jedediah didn't watch the man fall. He turned back to Samuel, who was now trembling, lips moving again. "I'm here," Jedediah whispered. "Right here, partner." Samuel's gaze flicked upward, locking onto his friend's weathered face. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Don't let him. Take it," he rasped. Jedediah leaned in closer. "This land," Samuel whispered. "Don't let him. Take." The words trailed off. His body stilled. Jedediah froze, hand still pressed to the blood-soaked shirt. The weight of Samuel's death hit him not like a bullet, but like a flood, the kind that breaks dams and drowns everything in its path. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The gunfire faded into a distant thudding, the screams muffled by the roar in his ears. He didn't move, couldn't. Then, somewhere behind him, Tommy fell to his knees. "No," the boy sobbed. "No, please." He clutched his rifle close, but his hands trembled violently. Tears streaked down his cheeks, leaving trails in the dust on his face. Jedediah finally rose, slow and unsteady. He stared out at the battlefield, not a heroic tableau, but a torn and bleeding wound on the prairie. Friends screamed, enemies retreated. The wind carried prayers and curses alike, and Samuel's last words rang in his ears like a bell that would never stop tolling. He lifted his face to the sky, a hollow cry tearing from his chest. It wasn't a shout of rage or vengeance. It was grief, deep, ragged, and raw, birthed from a place in the soul few ever reach, and fewer still return from. The cry echoed over the fields, silencing even the wind. Somewhere beyond the veil of smoke, Whitmore stood still. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, not regret, just the cold awareness of cost. Jedediah dropped to his knees beside Samuel again. He pulled the brim of his hat low, casting a long shadow across his friend's face. He didn't speak. There were no more words left in him. Tommy crawled closer, kneeling beside the two men. He reached out a hand and gripped Jedediah's coat sleeve. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice choked. Jedediah looked at him, not as a boy, but as someone who now understood the weight of standing for something bigger than oneself. "This is war, son," Jedediah said quietly, "and war always asks for more than it gives." The prairie lay in uneasy silence for a moment longer, broken only by the flicker of fire somewhere along the fence line and the soft moans of the wounded. From behind, the townsfolk began to gather, stepping over broken tools and fallen wood. Clara arrived, her apron stained with dust and blood, eyes wide with grief. She knelt, murmuring a prayer, voice shaking. Above them, the sun broke through the ash-gray clouds, casting long golden shafts of light across the carnage. But no light could touch the ache inside Jedediah. He had made a promise, and now that promise was etched in blood. The somber clang of the church bell cut through the prairie like a blade. Each ring echoed off the hills, drowning out even the faint, lingering shots that had punctuated the land just hours earlier. It was not a call to prayer. It was a cry of mourning. Inside the wooden church, packed to the walls, silence reigned. Every pew held faces drawn with grief. Dirt-smeared hands folded tight. Hats clutched against chests. The scent of gunpowder still clung to their clothes, mixing with the faint aroma of pine wood and old hymnals. Jedediah stood near the front, one hand resting on the closed pine casket, draped with Samuel's worn ranching coat. His shoulders were heavy, stooped not from age but from loss. His lips pressed into a line, eyes unmoving, fixed on the floorboards beneath his boots. Behind him, Reverend Paul cleared his throat, voice thick with emotion. "This land has known struggle," he began, gripping the edges of the pulpit, "but never before has it asked for so much from one of its own." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Samuel Carter was not a soldier. He was a friend, a husband, a man who sowed more than he reaped. And yet, he fell, not in battle, but in defense of something more sacred than any flag or frontier. Home. Murmurs rose, subdued but aching. Clara wiped her eyes with a crumpled handkerchief, her apron dusted with flour from the hot food she'd prepared for the watchman still standing guard. From the doorway a creak echoed, all heads turned. Whitmore stepped in. His long coat was still immaculate, though dust clung to his boots. Two of his hired men flanked him, but none bore arms today. He removed his hat slowly, eyes sweeping over the townsfolk as if seeing them for the first time. Reverend Paul didn't flinch. He stepped down from the pulpit and walked toward the aisle, facing Whitmore head-on. "I asked for a ceasefire," the Reverend said, voice steady. "One day, to bury our dead." Whitmore's jaw tightened, his lips parted, but no words came. "This town has given all it can," Paul continued, "but we will not bury our neighbors under the tracks of your rail line." A rustle swept through the pews. Even the air seemed to pause. Whitmore looked around, at the hard stares, the clenched fists, the quiet defiance worn on every face. Then his eyes settled on Jedediah. For a long, tense breath, the two men regarded one another. No words passed between them, just a mutual understanding forged in fire and loss. Whitmore gave the slightest nod. "Till sundown," he muttered, voice gravelly. "Then we finish this." And he turned, coat swirling, boots echoing against the floor as he disappeared through the doorway. Outside, the bell tolled again. Later, under the broad blue sky, the townsfolk gathered around the shallow grave carved into the earth behind the church. The Reverend read scripture, but few heard the words. Most watched Jedediah. He stood over the grave long after the others had stepped back. Tommy stood a few paces behind him, head lowered, the red cloth Martha once stitched still tied around his wrist. Jedediah knelt, scooping a handful of soil in his weathered hand. He let it trickle slowly onto the wooden box below, each grain falling like a promise. "I swore to you," he whispered, "we'd never let them take this place." The wind stirred. He rose, brushing the dust from his knees, eyes burning. "I'll see this through, Samuel. To the end." Behind him, Clara passed out bowls of stew and biscuits to the tired men and women, steam curling into the cool air. No one refused the food. They ate standing, back straight, eyes watching the horizon, because they knew This day was not the end of the war. It was only the breath before the last storm. And the bell that had once mourned would soon toll again, not in sorrow, but in reckoning. Night had cloaked the prairie in stillness, but inside the old wooden church at the heart of town, a warm glow pulsed like a living heart. Candles flickered in every window, casting soft halos over faces lined with dust and worry.
Reverend Paul stood at the pulpit, his voice low and steady, leading the townsfolk in a quiet hymn. The pews were full, farmers, wives, children, all drawn by something deeper than fear. The air felt charged, as if hope itself had taken form in the flickering flames. Jedediah Boone sat in the second row, his hat on his lap, head bowed. His shoulders sagged under the weight of grief and grit. Samuel's death still clung to him like smoke. The promise he made by that grave echoed in every heartbeat. We stand, or we die on our knees. Tommy Reed, no longer the boy who once shook while holding a rifle, rose from his seat beside Jedediah. His voice cracked, but carried. I may not be a man by years, but I swear on my mother's name, I'll fight for this land. I'll fight beside Mr. Boone, for Samuel, and for everyone here. I'm not running. Silence hung in the rafters for a long moment, and then a murmur of agreement stirred among the pews. Reverend Paul smiled gently. Faith, he said, isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act, even with trembling hands. Jedediah looked at Tommy, really looked, and saw not the trembling farm boy from weeks past, but a flame, small but fierce, born of loss and loyalty. He reached out and placed a calloused hand on the boy's shoulder. Your daddy'd be proud, he said, and so am I. Clara, sitting nearby, dabbed her eyes and leaned over, her hand finding Jedediah's. You're not alone, Jed, she whispered, her fingers firm around his. You never were, and you never will be again. Outside, the wind shifted. Through the stained glass panes, shadows danced, tall, flickering, unnatural. Clara's eyes darted to the window and she froze. The torches, she said under her breath. Jedediah stood, his bones aching but his stance unshaken. From the rear of the church, men and women began to rise. No one shouted, no one panicked, but they all felt it, an approaching storm made of greed and steel and fire. Reverend Paul raised his hands for silence. They think we're just soil and cattle, he said, but we are more. We are roots, and roots, when bound together, can crack stone. Tommy gripped his rifle with both hands, eyes locked on the door. From outside a glow swelled, a slow creeping orange, licking the edge of the horizon. Jedediah turned toward the altar one last time. Martha, he whispered, keep watch over us. Then he stepped into the night, where the fire waited. Dawn broke like fire over Boone's field. The sky burned crimson, casting a blood-red hue on the dry soil and brittle grass. Dust rose with the first gusts of morning wind, swirling through the still air like smoke from a coming blaze. The land was hushed, holding its breath, as if it too sensed what was about to unfold. From the ridge, torches still flickered, fading into the gray of morning light. Now replaced by rows of mounted men and glinting rifles, the company's force stood in full, stretching wide across the prairie. Their silhouettes loomed like a wave of iron. Jedediah Boone stood at the front line, Winchester in hand, boots planted firm into the dirt of the only home he'd ever known. Beside him was Tommy,
clutching his rifle, jaw clenched tight. Clara stood further back with the other townsfolk, her eyes fierce beneath the brim of her bonnet. Across the field, Whitmore sat atop a sleek black horse, his fine coat dusted with the grit of the land he tried to claim. Frank Delaney, the hired gunman, flanked him, eyes scanning the defenders like a hawk circling prey. "You still have time to walk away, Boone." Whitmore's voice rang across the field, sharp and cold. "This land belongs to progress now. You can't stop the rail." Jedediah didn't move. "This land belongs to those who bled for it." A beat of silence. Then Frank raised his hand. Gunfire cracked. The quiet of morning shattered into chaos. Rifles blazed, horses screamed. Dust exploded into the air, clouding vision, choking breath. Tommy dropped to one knee, firing into the haze. Clara ducked behind a wagon, reloading with trembling fingers. Jedediah aimed and fired, again and again, moving not with the recklessness of youth, but with the steadiness of purpose. He saw Frank raise his pistol to shoot, and fired first. Frank was thrown from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. The stallion reared and bolted. A cry of panic rippled through the company's ranks. Whitmore's face paled. His polished boots, once symbols of power, now shook against the stirrups. Jedediah stepped forward, blood on his shirt, dust in his beard, voice like thunder. "This land," he shouted, "was carved by calloused hands, fed by the tears of our dead. It belongs to the blood and bones of our people." Another volley of shots rang out. The company faltered. Men looked to Whitmore, who stared back wide-eyed, lips pressed thin. And then he cracked. "Fall back!" Whitmore shouted, yanking his horse's reins. "Pull back! Now!" The hired men turned, some tossing rifles, some still holding them in disbelief. The line collapsed like dry brush in wind, leaving behind a silence thick with smoke and sorrow. Jedediah dropped to his knees, the rifle slipping from his hands. His breath came ragged. Slowly he reached down and grasped a fistful of earth. The dirt clung to his fingers, warm, alive. Tears slid down his cheeks, cutting through the grime. "This," he whispered, pressing the soil to his chest, "is all I ever wanted to keep." Behind him, Tommy lowered his rifle and walked to his side. Clara followed, laying a hand on Jedediah's shoulder. Around them the town gathered, not cheering, not shouting, but holding one another, bound by something deeper than victory. It was love for land, for legacy, and it had been defended, not just by guns, but by heart. What once sounded like the roll of doom now came as salvation. The morning's telegraph wires buzzed across the plains, delivering the unexpected. Union Pacific had made its decision. After weeks of conflict and blood, sweat, and prayer, the railroad would divert, skirting Boone's land entirely. No steel would slice through their fields. No train whistle would mourn the end of their way of life. The battle was over, and they had won. Inside the tall, dry halls of the Union Pacific office, Whitmore sat slumped in a leather chair, tie loosened, eyes hollow. He didn't speak as the final papers were signed. The redirect order, sealed and stamped, was read aloud in a tone devoid of ceremony. Just another document, another reroute. But to the people of Boone, it was a declaration of survival. By midday, word had reached the town. The chapel bell rang once, then again, and again. No longer for mourning, but in celebration, the townsfolk spilled into the street.
Disbelief etched into their faces, slowly softening into tears, then cheers. People clutched one another with trembling hands. Laughter tangled in sobs. Even old ranchers who hadn't spoken in years clasped arms like brothers. Clara stood on the diner's porch, apron still dusted with flour, a trembling hand pressed to her lips. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, and with a deep, shaky breath she smiled and whispered, "Thank God." She turned her face to the wind, letting it dry the wet streak on her cheek. At the edge of the celebration stood Jedediah Boone, hat in hand, his silver hair tousled by the breeze. Dust still clung to the folds of his worn coat, the lines on his face deeper than ever. But his eyes, for once, were not heavy. Tommy burst through the crowd, eyes wide with wonder, and threw his arms around the old man's waist. "We did it!" he shouted. "We really did it!" Jedediah placed a steady hand on the boy's back, feeling the rapid heartbeat under his palm. Tommy pulled back just enough to look up at him. "Thank you, Ty," the boy said, his voice breaking. "You taught us how to fight, how to stay." Jedediah gave a slow nod, overwhelmed, unable to speak. Around them, the townsfolk were laughing, weeping, singing old hymns out of tune. It was joy that didn't need perfection, just release. But after a moment, Jedediah gently let go of Tommy. The noise of the celebration faded behind him as he turned and walked toward the far edge of the field, toward the old oak tree standing solitary against the open sky. His boots crunched over the dry earth, now safe, now his again. He reached the base of the tree, Martha's tree, and placed a hand on the trunk, fingers rough against the bark worn smooth by time and memory. His shoulders lowered as if laying down the final weight he'd carried too long. Behind him, Clara watched his retreat, hand still over her chest. A soft wind lifted her scarf as she exhaled slowly, her lips forming words no one could hear. Her eyes glistened, not with sorrow, but with something gentler. Relief. The crowd behind them carried on, but Jedediah stood still beneath the branches, head bowed, not in grief this time, but in gratitude, and the earth, undisturbed by iron or greed, whispered back. The sun dipped low, spilling golden light across the vast plains like a final blessing. The sky wore hues of amber and violet, brushed gently with threads of orange, and the wind rustled soft through the tall grass, whispering lullabies only the land understood. Jedediah Boone walked alone across the field, his boots sinking slightly into the earth he'd bled for, fought for, wept for. Each step slow, measured, not from pain, but reverence. In his weathered hands he carried a small candle, shielded by glass, its flame flickering but steady, much like the man himself. The oak stood ahead, proud and unwavering, its wide branches reaching toward heaven. Beneath it rested a simple stone, time-worn and familiar, bearing the name Martha Boone. No marble grandeur, no gilded script, just love carved in silence. He knelt. With stiff knees and a soft grunt, Jedediah lowered himself onto the earth, placing the candle gently before the grave. The flame wavered in the breeze, casting a tender glow upon the stone. He removed his hat and let the wind tousle his silver hair. "Martha," he whispered, voice dry as prairie dust. "The land's still ours." His throat tightened. His hand trembled as it reached out, fingers brushing across her name. We held it, just like we promised. They came with paper and guns, but the folks stood with me, with us. Silence answered, yet it wasn't empty. In the rustle of the leaves he felt her, quiet, warm, eternal. Behind him, quiet footsteps approached. Clara stood at a respectful distance, her arms crossed over her chest, eyes soft, a knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Reverend Paul was beside her, his Bible clutched to his chest, head bowed, not in sermon, but in tribute. They said nothing, just stood as sentinels to a moment sacred and raw. And then came Tommy. The boy moved slowly, not wanting to intrude, yet compelled to draw near. He knelt beside the old man, gaze fixed on the gravestone. His hands were no longer the hands of a child, dirt-lined, scarred from labor and loyalty. Jedediah turned to him, eyes glassy but strong. "She would have liked you, boy," he murmured. Tommy looked down, then back up. "I hope so." A beat of silence passed between them, heavy with years not yet lived, with wisdom not yet spoken. Jedediah reached out and placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder. Firm, proud. "You remember what we did here?" "I will," Tommy said. Then after a pause, his voice steady and sure, "We'll keep this land safe." The old man's lips parted, a tremble flickering at their edge. A single tear traced the groove of his cheek, falling soundlessly onto the soil. He didn't wipe it away. It belonged there. Above them, the oak swayed gently, its branches creaking like an old song. The candle flickered stronger for a moment, as if answering something unseen. The wind picked up, soft, not cold, and carried the scent of the earth, the memory of wheat, the echo of laughter once shared under this very tree. And maybe, just maybe, it carried a whisper too, from Martha. And so the sun finally dipped beneath the horizon, the land bathed in twilight, not in sorrow, not in fear, but in peace. Beneath the oak, the flame kept burning. Sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought with bullets, but with unshakable resolve. Jedediah Boone didn't stand against a railroad empire because he loved conflict, but because he loved what that land represented. Memory, legacy, and the promise of freedom passed down through generations. This story reminds us that land is more than dirt and boundaries. It's where stories begin, where families are built, and where love rests beneath old oak trees. And perhaps the deeper question isn't who owns the land, but who belongs to it. If this story stirred something in your heart, leave a comment with the number 1 below. Which part touched you the most, or reminded you of someone you know? And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to @KindnessAudio, where stories speak to the soul.